This is Inside Story, the only show about the system by people who lived it. I'm Lawrence Bartley.
Our prisons have gotten so violent that even if you didn't go in with a trauma disorder, it's hard to come out without one.
No kids in Angola! No kids in Angola! No kids in Angola!
A kid is different. And if a kid does something wrong, the kid needs help, not punishment.
They took the years away that was supposed to teach us how to grow up and be a man and replaced it with straight violence.
There's a lot of shows out there, but I promise you, you've never seen one like this. We're covering the system from a new perspective by and for the incarcerated community. I grew up in a system, spent nearly 3 decades behind bars, and when I was in, I didn't have access to news relevant to me. We're doing something about that. So whether you're on the inside, love someone who is, or simply care about what's happening in your country, this show is for you. And what better way to start this journey than with a look at how young people are ending up in one of the most infamous prisons in the country.
We pray that you touch the hearts of these people to not send these kids to Angola and to try to help these kids so they can have a better life. In Jesus' name, amen.
Amen.
We're in Baton Rouge, Louisiana at the state capitol with an organization called Family and Friends of Louisiana's Incarcerated Children. And they're about to crash a governor's meeting to voice their concerns about kids in Angola prison.
Louisiana is home to one of the nation's most notorious juvenile justice systems. After a series of high-profile escapes, suicides, and acts of violence in youth facilities, Governor John Bel Edwards announced plans to move several children to Angola, a maximum security prison for adults.
Excuse me, can I ask Governor? Can I ask you a question? He is going around the other way. I mean, we wanted to meet with the governor's office and he went out the back door.
The state says the move is about keeping children safe, but the protesters believe it's just the latest example of a system more geared towards punishing children than helping them.
No justice! No peace! No justice! No peace! No kids in Angola! No kids in Angola! No kids in Angola! Whose kids? Our kids! Whose kids? Our kids! Whose kids? Our kids!
Every young person that lives in Louisiana knows that this is the worst place ever.
Gina Womack runs Families and Friends of Louisiana's Incarcerated Children.
The governor stated that this was going to be a temporary transitional unit until they could stabilize the other facilities, and it was in the best interest of these young people who were supposedly wreaking havoc on some of the other young people, and it was a way to keep them safe and the other youth safe.
Now, as I understand, Angola was built for some of the toughest, hardened, grown criminals. The governor is saying that they're now going to house young teenagers there.
They are housing, and they are in a death row facility.
Louisiana has a long track record of treating juvenile offenders like adults. Even before the decision to move children to Angola, the state regularly subjected them to solitary confinement and ignored reports of abuse from officers at juvenile facilities.
The juvenile justice system, the way it was designed, is supposed to be to help these kids. It's supposed to be like a social welfare kind of setup. It's not supposed to be punishment, because the law recognizes that a kid is different. And if a kid does something wrong, the kid needs help, not punishment.
Beth Schwartzapfel has covered the Louisiana justice system for the Marshall Project, including revealing the experience of children held in solitary confinement.
From the perspective of the juvenile offenders, like at this point, what are the conditions that they're forced to live in?
They were in these cinder block rooms there were these solid steel doors with a tiny slot where they would pass the food through, and they were held in there for 24 hours a day. What's wild is they had these light fixtures in the ceiling and they had like sprinklers. The kids were so stir crazy and bored and frustrated that they took apart the light fixtures and the sprinklers and they started using the pieces to dig holes in the wall so that they could climb through the cells to see one another and talk to one another. And the state would come in, replace the light fixtures, the same thing would happen again. So then the state responded by removing the lights. And then the kids started taking their beds apart and using the pieces from their beds to dig holes. And so they took away the beds. So for some of these kids, it was like literally a mattress on a concrete floor in the dark. So,
Right.
you know, it's not like an adult serving a life sentence. Not that that makes it okay.
Right.
But, you know, there are going to be adults, grown adults, who are going to go into society.
And you're sending them from an environment in which it's just a black box.
It's damaging. I
Yeah.
mean, it's a black box literally and figuratively, right? You're damaging them. You are sending them out into the world with more problems than they came in.
Solitary confinement don't do nothing but like, it make it deteriorate, especially if you a juvenile. Around that time, everything based off like influence and what you intaking. So however you gonna be or what you transform into gonna be based off what you learning at that time. And if you in solitary confinement, you can't learn nothing but the way the bricks look around you.
Darren Dew and D'Angelo Davis both testified in April of 2022 at a hearing for HB 746, a bill inspired in part by Beth's reporting that would limit solitary confinement for children. How old were you when you got incarcerated?
14.
I was 15.
14? 15? Tell me about the facilities and what it was like for you all to experience that.
The conditions of the buildings, it looked like it'd been there for over 100 years. That's the worst thing ever, the living conditions. Mold in the shower and shit like that.
And rats and shit. Like, yeah, have a whole dorm like making a juice out of rats being in the dorm. You become like adapted to that type of stuff. Like, you ain't around nothing but other males all day. So it's like buku aggression and testosterone in the dorm. So no matter how you look at it, you're gonna be like kind of developing into what's around you.
Like, they took the years away that was supposed to teach us how to grow up and be a man and replaced it with straight violence.
What effect did solitary confinement have on you as a person?
Man, solitary confinement made me, it's kind of like antisocial now. Like, I don't like people now. Like, man, I got major anxiety now. I had to get drunk when I go out there or something just to loosen up a little bit to enjoy myself. And it wasn't like that before jail.
The bill limiting juvenile solitary was signed into law last June, but hope for any real reform was short-lived. The planned transfer of young people to Angola was announced soon after. The Louisiana governor and Office of Juvenile Justice didn't respond to several requests for comment. So how did we go from this victory after your reporting to kids being locked up on former death row in Angola prison?
I think we got from A to B because, you know, you can make a law that says that you can't hold kids in solitary confinement for more than 24 hours at a time, right? Which is what the law says. That doesn't address any of the underlying issues, right? Like, why is the state holding kids in solitary confinement? Because these kids are seriously troubled and need a tremendous amount of help that the state does not have the resources to provide. That is still true.
The reason that's stated for sending juveniles to Angola prison is that it's a temporary solution for those who have been very disruptive and violent towards staff members.
How long, though? Because if that's the case, solitary confinement is a temporary solution. You know what I'm saying? But they was abusing it.
They gonna always abuse that.
And that's the thing. They gonna always abuse their authority. Who actually dare to see what they doing? No one. No one.
So this is a great idea you guys have.
Perhaps no one has become more synonymous with fighting to end mass incarceration and excessive punishment than Bryan Stevenson, a professor, best-selling author, and lawyer whose work helped reduce life sentences for kids. So let's just jump right in.
Okay.
You did a lot of work arguing before the Supreme Court that's been so impactful. Can you tell us about that?
Sure. We were really thrilled when the Supreme Court declared that mandatory life without parole sentences for all children are unconstitutional. And, you know, we've been going around the country representing young people who had those sentences.
Yeah.
When I go places, there are now about 1,000 people who were told they were going to die in prison with life without parole, who have not only had their sentences reduced, but have been released. And one of the joys of my career is I go places and I meet people and they'll come up to me and say, hey man, I'm one of your guys. And you know, to see them doing well and doing flourishing, it's just such a powerful statement about how wrong it was to ever say to some child that you're not fit. You know, you're fit only to die in prison.
You probably don't know, but I'm one of your guys.
Oh, beautiful.
Yeah, I myself, I was sentenced to 27 and a third years to life.
Yeah.
And during my incarceration, I went from a GED to a master's degree.
Yeah.
So I was a fit candidate for parole.
Yeah.
But when I made it to the parole board, I was denied. So I filed a lawsuit using your case, stating that by denying me parole, it's tantamount to giving me life without parole. Did you ever intend that case having that kind of usage?
Oh, absolutely, absolutely. I mean, I think part of what I've been interested in is just pushing back against this idea that became very popular in the 80s, where you had criminologists going around to legislatures arguing that some children aren't children, that some kids aren't kids. They look like kids and they talk like kids. But these folks argued that they weren't kids, and they came up with that term. They said these are, quote, super predators. And that demonizing label was used to create all of these horrific policies. It's been heartbreaking because that's where the schoolhouse to jailhouse pipeline was constructed, and fear and anger that was behind that rhetoric just caused us to look away. And I've always believed that all children are children, and you don't judge a society and its commitment to children by looking at how well it treats talented kids and gifted kids and privileged kids. A society's commitment to children has to be judged by how we're treating kids that have fallen down, kids that are struggling, kids that are poor, kids that have been abused, kids in detention facilities. I mean, I think generally the idea of just saying to someone, you should die in prison, is a flawed idea. Because people change. I don't think it's a healthy way to punish. It's not a sensible way to punish. And I think to take away someone's possibility for growth and change, to establish that they're not a threat to public safety, is irresponsible. It's punitive without purpose. And a system that punishes people without purpose is a system that loses its legitimacy. It loses its credibility.
Well, let's go back a bit. You started practicing law because these lawyers empowered you by giving you the right to go to a school of your choice.
Yeah.
But why criminal law?
You know, my great-grandfather was enslaved in Virginia in the 1850s. And he decided he was going to learn to read, even though there were anti-literacy laws that meant that if they discovered he could read, he might be sold or killed. And sure enough, freedom came after the Civil War. And my grandmother told me that once a week, my great-grandfather would stand on the porch of their house, and formerly enslaved people who couldn't read would come to their house, and he would read the newspaper to them so they would know what was going on. And in that respect, it feels like, you know, I'm carrying on a tradition that enslaved people gave to their children, and my grandparents gave to their children, and my parents gave to me. And I want to give it to another generation. You know, I want, you know, the children of my children, our children, to live in a world where they're not burdened by the presumption of dangerousness and guilt that gets so many people wrongly accused and wrongly convicted. I want us to live in a world where we're not throwing people away because we're angry or we're afraid.
What are some of the intangibles with trying to change the criminal justice system that people don't see?
Yeah, Alabama's still a very active death penalty state. A man was executed, and he was basically tortured for 3 hours. Joe James He was on the gurney for over 3 hours. They couldn't access his vein. And then the next person scheduled for execution, the lower court said, oh, we don't trust you all to carry out this execution. We're going to stop it. We're going to issue a stay. But the U.S. Supreme Court vacated the stay, and they put the second man on a gurney, and they poked and prodded him for 2 hours, couldn't find a vein. And eventually, they had to call off the execution. So for the first time in my career, I'm now seeing people who have survived execution attempts in this country. And I think what people don't recognize, some of the intangibles to that, is that it demeans everybody. It dehumanizes everybody. Those correctional staff who were part of that, many of them were vomiting because it was so unacceptable that they were playing a role in torturing a human being. Many of them won't recover from what they were forced to do in doing something as horrific as carving on a human being so that they could kill him. And, you know, I've always said that the death penalty isn't a topic, isn't an issue we can decide by asking whether people deserve to die for the crimes they've committed. The threshold question for me has always been, do we deserve to kill? If we have a system that treats you better if you're rich and guilty than if you're poor and innocent, if we have a system where poverty is the biggest predictor of who's going to end up on the row, if we have a system compromised by politics, compromised by racial bias, and so we shouldn't be in the business of executing people at all.
There's a lot of people in this country who are convicted of crimes who are guilty.
Yeah.
There's a lot of people convicted of crimes who are innocent.
Yep.
Then there are those who are in between,
That's
those who deserve a second chance
Yeah.
because they did 180s.
Yeah.
But I find myself sometimes being overwhelmed with, because I'm just one person, and it's very difficult to help everyone.
Sure.
So I would imagine with the kind of work you've done, so many people learn about you, and everyone gets a lawyer, but not everyone gets a Bryan Stevenson.
Yeah, yeah.
So I was wondering, how do you remedy that?
You know, it's hard because, I mean, we went from 300,000 people in jails and prisons in the early 1970s to 2.2 million people in jails and prisons today. We've got nearly 5 million people on probation parole. There are hundreds of thousands of people that are burdened and restricted and menaced by the criminal legal system. And we haven't invested in creating the kind of resources, lawyers, helpers, people who can help folks navigate all of these challenges. And we keep expanding our work largely because I just see the need for that. You know, I'm hoping that people incarcerated can recognize that there's a community of people who want to join in this effort to get to higher ground, to kind of break down these narratives of punishment and exclusion and discarding people.
Wow. Thank you, Bryan. You're
You're
an
welcome,
amazing
man.
human being.
Well,
man.
thank you, brother. Absolutely. Absolutely.
Life Inside is a collection of essays about people's unique experiences with the system, but we cut out everything else and let them tell you their stories.
I ease into a narrow parking space at the West County Detention Center in Richmond, California, draw 3 steady breaths, and exhale. I am visiting my son for the first time since he's been incarcerated. Inside, the waiting room is sparse, with little furniture, few people, and 2 correctional officers. One takes my ID and my completed visiting form and tells me to have a seat. On Saturdays and Sundays, the space is filled with weary grandmothers, anxious wives, and distressed sisters. Visitors are mostly Latinas and African American women. Many will come with colorfully manicured nails and well-groomed tresses, but they will not be so dolled up as to break the jailhouse rules of appropriate attire. Sometimes there will be men too, but they are generally on the other side of the bars. My jeans, t-shirt, and short, unpainted nails will make me stand out, and my whiteness. I will bring blueberry muffins to share with those in the waiting room in an attempt at building community, a gentle reminder that we are deserving of sweetness. On my first visit, though, I am alone. One guard belts out, "Vargas!" I pass through a metal detector and make my way down a long corridor. Without acknowledging me, the officer strides ahead of me. I take her haste to be a power play and choose to walk at a respectable pace, my chin up. My son plucks the phone from his cradle, and his lower lip begins to quiver. Before he can bring the handset to his mouth, he erupts into sobs. I'm sorry, Mama, I'm so sorry. I love you. I love you. I love you. The words escape me before I realize they're mine. Our conversation is limited, both by the fact that his grief impairs his capacity to speak and by the knowledge that every word we utter is under surveillance. But words are unnecessary. I see him through motherly eyes, a well-intentioned, gentle teen who got caught up in the moment and committed an act he already regrets. I hear him with motherly ears, the raspy, gasping voice begging for the forgiveness that I've already given him. I feel his pain with motherly perception, gutted that I cannot protect him. The criminal justice system regards him as an adult. I wonder if those aloof correctional officers are aware of these facts. I wonder if they are trained to be apathetic or if the empathy is drained out of them through their years of service. I wonder if they know that my son is loved.
Thinking about youth incarceration in this country merits a bit of history. 3 decades ago, a Princeton criminologist coined the term super predator to describe young people he believed were likely to commit brutal crimes. Let's be real, he meant young people of color. Today, we know it was all nonsense, but in many ways, its legacy still lives on. Kids who find themselves behind bars are often treated not just like adults, but worse. I've seen officers slap around and embarrass young people in a way they would never deal with adults. And their youth means they're less equipped for traumas of the system. Some still believe in the stereotypes that gave life to the super predator myth. They cross the street when they see a bunch of kids being kids or making a scene. Not me. I see my young self. I see my life sentence. I see my time in solitary. And I see kids forced by the world around them to act a lot tougher than they really are. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you next time.